Do not go and harass, insult, berate, or send death threats to anybody in this video or any behavior similar to that. Thank you. Hello everybody, my name is TRG. I'm a guy that plays games while being lame, and I love indie games. And there's quite a few that are out there. Some of them will have publishers, some of them will not. But it's always a tricky conversation to decide what is and isn't indie. Obviously, you don't know the deals, obviously you don't know a lot of the funding, and obviously somebody can go through loopholes and say, well, they got funding through X, Y, and Z, but then there's also this, but if you actually trace it, there's a whole bunch of stuff with it. And where it seems to be more of a money tax scam, but that's a whole nother thing. I was searching around and I saw this video, the Indie Fib. While I do like the video, I feel like there are many points that do not go to a decent standard, and I feel like it misses the plot a lot of times, or says certain things that are just incorrect. So before I go, let's talk about indie and what it is. In the most objective way, the standard that is not my definition or anything, indie is short for independent. What is that in context of games? Well, that is independent from the rest of the industry. Now, there's levels to this. Certain indie games may be more into the industry than others and be at a 70%, but that's still a passing grade of a C. But there are going to be certain indie games like Hollow Knight, in where it completely shuts itself off from the rest of everybody else, and at best they may have extra help that they hire via contract to go and do something like translation or maybe extra programming that they don't have time for. But they're not going and getting a big publisher, getting large amounts of funding, sometimes millions of dollars, and making a game off of that. And like I said, an indie game can be more into it. The reason why I'm setting this up is I think a lot of people immediately see publisher and go, not indie. But that's not true, and it doesn't really interact with what is actually indie. So with all that set up, let's get on to the video, and let's go and look at the first problem.
Most concerned with here is massive publisher support via venture capital, aka directly funding the development of game studios. Understand that there are in fact caveats to publishing deals, and just because a game has a publisher doesn't mean it necessarily negates its indie status. For example, as far as I understand, New Blood doesn't actually provide any capital towards game development.
So my first problem is that he focuses on capital. Capital is not what makes an indie game indie. Even if it has a publisher giving it its capital, it matters whether or not that publisher is going to exert control or take it into a different direction. Who controls the marketing? Who controls what the game is going to be made? Who actually controls the finances at the end of the day? There's going to be a lot of publishers that basically have a lot of control when it comes to that. And at the end of the day, that's not going to be indie. But signing a contract to say like, hey, I need help funding because I cannot go create the art. I cannot go create this. I cannot go create the programming. I cannot go and create all this by myself. I need to go get a team now. That can still be indie. The problem is when capital starts to get into the development and takes a turn for the worse. A great example is Cuphead. The developers were literally refinancing their homes. And it seems like it wasn't during the last stretch either. They needed money for a large chunk of development, in which then Microsoft came in and said, hey, we're going to help finance you. But nobody would contest that that's not a indie story. So while capital may be a great indicator, it's not a great standard to say whether or not you got funding, therefore you lose your indie status. And he does recognize that there are caveats, but the caveats that he brings up is only for the last stretch. Not necessarily. There's also small-time publishers which will give financing, but then will be separate once again from the rest of the game industry. They're not going to finance or help finance a large studio. They're going to go do it with Joe Schmo over there. A great example of this is Dread XP. Dread XP is a publisher, but if you look at all their games, everybody would consider this a bunch of indie games. Why? Well, because they're still relatively small. They're only giving funding for these very small things. And while, yes, they are reliant on this publisher to help them out, the alternative is that the game doesn't exist. and it's also not taking control of anything or being the major financial decision maker for this. The reason that I say this is because it is separate from what is the normal structure where you would get a publisher and they may have a say in how they want the game to be made, or that there's some corporate bureaucracy in there. That is why people treat games that may have a publisher as indie as well, and why most people would think that as well. So, with all that, funding is not the end all be all of whether or not a game is indie or not. Because once again, indie, in context of its definition, what the word is, because it's short for independent, is independent from the rest of the game landscape. If they are still within this small bubble, they're still in. If they want to move around in this small bubble, they can.
Help out developers in other ways. I think the important distinction is that a creator of an indie game wouldn't be beholden to New Blood, as they would still be solely responsible, or at least the main driving force behind the development of said game. New Blood loaning out one of its 50 employees to occasionally help out isn't the deciding factor on a game materializing.
Here's the thing though, New Blood does also provide funding for games as well, because obviously, you need funding for games. Whether it be public, like crowdfunding or something else, New Blood does actually do that. It's not just like they just rent out an employee and say, hey, you're gonna work on this project, which they may do. But the problem is that they will also go and provide funding for things, and the thing is that they're self-reliant on their own funding, which is a lot of small indie publishers. They help make games. They'll have like a contract that says, we'll take 10% of royalties. We'll help you with merchandising, in which that's where we're gonna make a lot of our profit from, and so on and so forth. I think this person does have a very big skewed thing of what a publisher actually does, because there are many different ways of what a publisher actually does. The main thing is financing, but sometimes they can say, we will just give you money, we'll give you X amount of budget, and then you go and do it on your own, which is what he seems to be implying from, New Blood, but he also seems to think that it's just the employees, which is not the case.
Look, let me illuminate what I'm actually trying to say by taking a look at a few examples that are hopefully still fresh in people's mind to illustrate my point. Mouse PI is a recently released boomer shooter with a unique art style, but how indie is this indie game? Well, Fumi Games lists 30 people on its LinkedIn, and it was published by Playside Games, who is one of the biggest video game publishers in Australia. So a studio of 30 people was given was given money by a publicly traded large publisher.
So we have a very irrelevant point of that is a publicly traded and large studio. Let's actually look how large it is. Let's look at their stocks. Oh, let's translate that into American dollars. Maybe it's better. Oh, that's not really a great publicly traded company if it's that low. Anyway, let's go look at their catalog. Maybe they have a lot of success with their catalog, and that's where their money really is. Maybe he's right. It's like a big corporation. It has lots of money. It makes things just not indie. Oh, oh no. Oh, no. 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 Okay, maybe the here. Okay, well we have here we have Westeros, that's good. We have Kill Knight, we have 3, Age of Darkness and Thrive, but okay, maybe let's go, cuz oh no. Okay, let's transfer over to Steam because maybe they'll have something good. Um and that's good, but that's good, but okay, so that this idea that this is a large like Australian corporation that has like stupid funding is just unfortunately not true. I don't really know why people don't really do their research to really look at it, but in the last couple years, they only had a few major hits. And it seems that they are doing the same thing as New Blood, where it seems that they're reliant on merchandising, and it may seem to be also mobile games, and where they might be getting a lot of their money. But they are definitely nowhere in this thing of that they are this super large publisher that has all this stuff at their fingertips. When you're actually looking at it, every game that they have is very, very basic. Just going back to one of their positive hits, Kill Knight is a top-down shooter like Enter the Gungeon. Uh, you have Age of Darkness, Final Stand, a top-down tactical uh, game in which they made it themselves. You have, once again, going back, Thrive, Heavy Lies. It's a top-down once again. And then obviously you have Mouse PI, which is probably their biggest like financial cost. But like you go over here, they made Kill Knight and Age of Darkness, and then they had somebody else make this, and all these would not be big financial burdens. The same thing goes for their mobile games. It's just not really there. This narrative that they're this large company once again is not correct. Saying that it's a large publisher is like saying I'm a large man. Like, eh? You can see me? No. It has things under its belt, but it's nowhere with the big dogs that we're trying to talk about. And he does use the argument of, well, what do people really mean by indie? Would you consider Steam indie? No. This one would be the same way. What do you mean by large? Would people consider this large? No.
Excuse me, but you're describing the conditions of every goddamn game made in the 2000s. American McGee's Alice, Rogue had 25 to 27 people. Call of Duty, Infinity Ward consisted of 21 to 27 people specifically working on COD. Fear, 30 people at Monolith.
I don't really understand this point because it's not necessarily relevant to whether or not something is an indie game. You could have 1,000 people work on a project and it would still be indie because that is completely irrelevant to what makes something indie. Like, let's take Terraria Calamity, which is one of my beloved mods, rest in peace. That had like a large group of people similar to a normal dev team. This idea that, it's not indie because it has, a bunch of people in it doesn't necessarily matter because it doesn't really make that much sense and also doesn't touch anything of like what indie is supposed to be, once again being independent. But let's go through a few examples of what he said. Call of Duty. Well, Call of Duty was by Activision, and let's go and look at the 2000 catalog for Activision and its publishing deals. So here we are. This is Activision. If we go down, you'll notice, hey, this is quite a bit. This is a lot. How many games do they have? I don't know. Look at this. So we get all the way down here. Then we have EA, which was for Alice. If we go down once again, hey, this is large. Look how many. Then we go over here once again. This is for another game that he brought up. Hey, this is for Fear. Hey, look at all these games. And I should state that this is just their 2000 catalog. This is not their previous record of other years. Once again, he has said before that it's disingenuous to compare Steam because it's relatively separated from the industry to say that it's indie, but then yet he's comparing games that have these giant, massive studios and trying to put this thing, which has a bunch of mobile games in it, not even like DS games or mobile consoles or anything, that has 3, 4, I believe that's coming up, but 3 hits out of its entire lifespan. I am really confused with this argument because, once again, it's irrelevant and, by his own standard, is disingenuous.
This comes with two arguments I want to preemptively tackle. First off is the idea that the game's status as indie or not would depend on how much development time it spent without publisher support.
Actually, it wouldn't necessarily matter. Once again, it depends on what the publisher is doing to the game rather than whether or not you have a publisher and who that publisher is. Unfortunately, it seems by his definition, large is just a publisher being able to be a publisher. So even if you have two nickels and a shoestring as a publisher and you give that to a development team, you're still a large publisher by his standards, I guess. I'm gonna cut the next argument because A, I think that it's stupid because I don't think many people would say that, or that he's misconstruing it a little bit. But B, it also doesn't really matter overall to the point. If you want to go and see what the argument was, link down below. I always do that, but
Moving on, let's take a look at indie darling Claire Obscure Expedition 33. Core team of 30 people, cool. Headed by an industry veteran, okay, fine. Did they publish it themselves? Of course not. They were published by Kepler Interactive.
which by his own standards doesn't really matter because if he researched the timeline instead of trying to just make a bunch of things not indie and make arguments against their indie status, they came in 2 years before the game was published, which is very different and is extremely hard to do if the game is not already like in a state of like 80% completion by that point. Which he already said, like, yeah, there are going to be things that, he accepts, like 90% completions, and then they do the home stretch. This would have been during the home stretch of development with very few things to do. I reiterate, the game was released 2 years after that.
Who is majority owned by NetEase, a billion-dollar Chinese company, and one of the founding members of Kepler also happens to be a former director of NetEase. Isn't that a big coincidence?
Oh, great. Conspiracy theorist logic. Everybody clap! But in a serious way, there would be a point if he could actually make it, but unfortunately he fails. But let's actually go and talk with not ignorance, and let's actually talk how business models work. You need capital to start things. That is kind of the whole conversation that is here, and that's one of the biggest things with indie game is that getting capital is very hard to actually get. Doing things by yourself sucks. What most likely happened is that the director used his connections to secure capital to have investors, but they wanted something in return. So then they made that deal. That's the coincidence. That's what happened. That is the most likely scenario. If you ever watch Shark Tank, you know that. Like I said, there's an actual argument to be made, but he doesn't actually make it. He just goes, "Isn't that just weird? Isn't that just a coinky dink?" That's not a point. Instead of just saying like, hey, this person had connections with the previous company, so obviously there's going to be a working relationship to gain capital, I would say because the person's relationship with the previous company allowed them to gain capital at an insane market rate in which they became the majority shareholder, which seems to have always been. Therefore, its status as a publisher and it being somewhat independent is weakened. That means that when Kepler came in during the development, it started to get into conversations of whether or not that interactivity between the development means whether or not it should be indie. But you also got to remember that the timeline is different. They were already developing this and they only came in during the last 2 years, at least from what we have officially. This means that there's a conversation to be had, but how he actually does it, like I said, is just kind of bad.
Oh, and when I said 30 people, I mentioned it was the core team. And that is an important distinction because there are 416 people listed in the credits. Now, obviously, not all of those people were developers. There are plenty of roles to fill that wouldn't fall under that umbrella. But plenty of these contractors were indeed brought on to help program the game.
And you know how many indie games actually do that? Jesus, man, this really is just like speaking out of ignorance. There are so many indie games that contract people because they don't want employment, because they can't afford health insurance, they can't afford other things, they don't have a business, and so that they contract them. Unless you are like the sole person, more than likely, if you get a publisher, an indie publisher, you are indie game, you might contract someone. Even Hollow Knight contracted people. And I'm not talking about Silksong. The original Hollow Knight contracted people. You know, the one that was only on its own sales and public funding that was only about like 58K. Also, I verified the claim that, well, these people were helping program and all that. No, that's not the case. They didn't program it. The only other one that they had was porting, which is a completely different thing. Generally, you would have people that port that on contract. Even indie games do that. It's great to deny. It's not great to do things when they're verifiable and it's incorrect. These are the only two things that I could find in the credits that relate anything to programming. The 300 that he's talking about is like orchestra, QA testing, motion capture, not much of actual development.
Honestly, the indie winners at the Game Awards is a laundry list of games that aren't actually indie. Stray was published by Annapurna Interactive, who also just published Mixtape, just so you know.
That point would hit so much harder if his previous points weren't bad. Like, this is one of the points that is actually good, especially when he says this, which is 100% verifiable.
Annapurna is a company headed by a multi-millionaire Nepo baby, Megan Ellison, who along with her father Larry Ellison have open and deep ties to Israel. Do with that what you will. With Dave the Diver, there isn't even the fucking pretense that it's an indie game. It was developed in-house by a division of Nexon, one of the biggest South Korean game publishers out there.
Like I said, this point would hit so much harder if the rest of the video wasn't riddled with irrelevancies, discrepancies in his own like arguments where he'll say one thing and then argue against it, and so on and so forth. Like, these are two great examples of like why we are overusing the word indie, and I would argue even some of the ones that I defended, I would argue against them being indie. But because these arguments are so bad, these points really do not land.
So what the hell am I making this video for, if masquerading as an indie game doesn't actually do anything tangible? Well, I certainly have a few more complex opinions that I'll get to later, but first and foremost, how about I just don't like being fucking lied to? I don't like being told that something is X when it's actually Y.
The problem is here is that a lot of like what you say is X is not actually Y, but you're trying to make it into Y. Let's take this. If I say a glass of water is H2O and you get mad at me because you say, well, somebody could put salt in it. Yeah, those are two different things though. That's not water. That's water and salt. The best standard for indie is you look at it and you see whether or not it's separate from the game like area, landscape, genre, whatever you want to call it. See what was the reason for creation, how it got its funding, and so on and so forth. A great way that I will give you is Stray. Like, Stray is a great argument to say, hey, this was funded by a $1 million corporation that has ties to governments. Maybe this shouldn't be considered indie. But when you say like, hey, there was programmers when there wasn't programmers for Clear Expedition 33, that's when I have a problem because you are lying to yourself. It's very easy to get caught up in arguments like this just because there's things that could be added, just because there's things that are this, because there's things that are Y, well, just because there's things that are X. But trying to shrink the bubble of X because you don't like it or you think differently does not actually make a point. If you think that the definition of indie should be tightened, that's actually a fair point. But that's not what is happening here. There is a bunch of false distinctions and dichotomies that you're offering that don't actually do much and just bring up, once again, I will always say this, a bunch of irrelevancies. I think what is really causing this conflict is that he's focusing on irrelevant things that don't actually matter and putting importance onto them, and then saying, therefore, if it has this, it's not indie, which makes little to no sense as we've seen before. And I think this importance really is blinding him because he says certain things that don't really make any sense. And I'm going to skip a little bit into the video to kind of show this, but he does say this.
Was that the indie sector quietly morphed into the A or even AA space, and no one really noticed or cared to make that distinction.
That's because A is indie. There's a reason why you never heard of A games, because that's indie. But like I said, it really does show that he's focusing on things that are irrelevant. And I think that I don't want to be mean, but he may not have enough knowledge of this, as he has consistently showed time and time again he has failed a lot of research. He then goes into a bunch of hypotheticals, which actually don't really matter, and you probably won't actually see unless you go and put Mr. Evil Money Hands into the conversation, so I don't really know why he's trying to make an argument about this, but let's go and actually indulge in it.
But as long as publishers are a factor, these are long-term concerns, and they're also the fundamental difference between these projects and true indie games. True indies hold all the cards at any given time. They aren't subject to the whims of the market. That is the difference. And yes, this requires that the individual take on all the risks themselves, but that is the trade-off.
Fear-mongering publishers and saying oogity boogity, if you have a publisher, you're not a true indie, doesn't actually really do much, and that's what a lot of these arguments are. And especially when you're just trying to say like, oh well, a publisher could do this, this, and this. It's like, yeah, they could, but why would they? A lot of the times, the publishers aren't going to take a lot from the actual sales. They might have royalties and stuff, but they're not going to do that. Most are going to focus on merch and other things. So even if a game fails, they can still turn a profit. They don't really care. Unless a game fails so poorly, there's nothing that would actually happen like that. It would have to fail so hard. But let's actually focus on this fear-mongering of stuff and true indie. Binding of Isaac is not true indie by his standards, even though it is indie by any other metric imaginable. Binding of Isaac Rebirth has a publisher. And you know what? They don't have any say when it comes to the game. That's all Ed McMillan's. So once again, we can see that there are examples that show this fear thing of, well, they're going to control things, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, not actually play out a lot of the time. Why? Well, because a lot of contracts don't have publishers getting that much power. It's mostly fund and investment. And if one publisher doesn't want to help you out, you just move on to another publisher. A lot of small publishers will help other indie games, whether that be sequels, whether that be you wanting to make another game. Even if you have failed games in the past, if they just think that it's good, they're going to be like, okay, let's help you. But once again, whether or not you have a publisher doesn't really matter. It matters what is the publisher, how big they are, so on and so forth. What are they doing, whether or not they will take control, etc.
And to bring it back to the initial subject, that being the unreal praise that successful indies get in the first place, isn't that kind of the point? The individual is assuming the financial risk of a game that they believe in. It's a gamble to be sure, but that's why it's so inspiring when it pays off.
Yes and no. It's more admirable, but like if we take the standard of like, well, this indie game did crowdfunding, therefore it's not indie because it made X amount of money through crowdfunding. It's like, that doesn't really make much sense. This is why the financial part doesn't really do much, and especially if you just take the standard of, well, it's a publisher, it doesn't really make much sense because it's just a different way of doing funding. Like I said over and over again, if you want to go and make a argument that you were overusing indie and point to specific reasons, yes, but trying to make a grand standard of can't have a publisher, can't have this, can't have Y, that's not a great argument. They're not getting richer. Matter of fact, they might actually be in a worse situation by that point. So just because somebody does harder work doesn't necessarily mean that we can't celebrate people that have a slightly easier time. Let's skip ahead because I want to make one last point on something that he said.
Isn't just some crazy notion I cooked up on my own. The general public already has this set of expectations and standards, it's just largely not being applied properly.
No, you made up a lot of those standards. I don't know why you're trying to act like this is the general public. Some of them you were on track, but then you just kind of shut the gate and said anything that can't fit through this small keyhole is not indie, that's not how that works. A person with a key can enter a door.
All I'm saying is, let's not reward companies for things they haven't even accomplished. Because if we're not going to bother to make a distinction between something like Claire Obscura 33 and I don't know, Undertale, FNAF, Super Meat Boy, whatever example you want to use, we might as well not make any distinctions or critiques at all.
The problem is that that's a false dichotomy. You can make distinctions and you can say like, hey, this is a more like successful indie in my eyes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a whole new category. There's many things in categories where there's no distinction between them until you get deeper into that category, and you can see that. Take boxing, for example. If you say, hey, I'm a boxer and this guy's a boxer, there's no distinction between those categories. But then you go in and you see this is a lightweight boxer, this is a heavyweight boxer. They're both still boxers at the end of the day. Trying to say the lightweight boxer isn't a boxer because the guy can punch harder than him doesn't really make much sense. And that's where a lot of these arguments come from, or at least the logic is. I'm not here to say, like, you can't think this way. But when we're trying to make criticisms, when we're trying to say this can't be indie, or these are false indies, or it's the greatest fib ever, we have to have a lot better structure than this. There's a lot of, and I don't want to be mean, I don't want to necessarily put a person down, but there's a lot of ignorance here. Whether or not it is willing, I'm not going to say. I'll let you guys decide that. But there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of factually incorrect things. I do agree with the premise that a lot of things overuse indie. But that being said, a lot of what he got would be indie. Out of this entire video, we had a few examples that were there to support his points and a lot of nothing. I'm actually disappointed because I wanted to agree with the premise, but it just didn't do much. But anyways, my name is TRG. I'm a guy that plays games while being lame. I wish that there was a lot more because there was actually a few good points that I was like, yes, but you know. Anyways, I'll see you guys later in the next video. I don't know what it should be. Bye bye.